Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. I've just been making a ton of videos lately. What's going on? In this one, we're going to finish that old 2005 article from the ComputerGames magazine. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I'll have it linked in the description. If you remember, this issue had previews of some exciting features being added to the game, and that's the new honor system, new instances, Battlegrounds, and world events. Blizzard isn't resting on its accolades. What will happen when its orcs and gnomes hit puberty? A look inside the near future of World of Warcraft. The biggest effort early on will be to add many new instances, including raid instances, to the current mix of spawned areas. That's right, it's kind of easy to forget that this was just a few months in. The only raids that we had at this point are the Molten Core and Onyxia's Lair, something that they're emulating for Official Classic. These raids are designed to challenge around 40 people at a time with various objectives in mind, with some pretty amazing loot at stake. As of this writing, the highest level item in the game is coded purple or epic, such as the Deathstriker dagger with a speed of 1.70 and a 45.6 damage per second, with all attacks guaranteed to land, all of which will be critical strikes for the next 3 seconds. Whoa. I was a little confused by this because this is actually called the Fellstriker dagger. I remember it well as a vanilla rogue. It was indeed the Deathstriker dagger though, and was only changed in patch 1.3 for some reason, which must have come after this article. But in a raid, you might be able to pick up 2 more valuable classes of equipment: Legendary, which is red, and Artifact, which is orange. So, a small error or possibly a change here, because legendaries were the orange ones. And as for artifacts, although these were often rumored and even hoaxed back then, they only saw the light of day in the Legion expansion. The reason they picked 40 as sort of the magic number for a raid population cap was because, on average, that's the size of a World of Warcraft guild. That's a cool fun fact, I think. I always wondered, why 40? Was that standard of other MMOs at the time? It seemed a rather large and cumbersome amount, which it was. Coordinating 40 people was quite the task, and to make matters worse, this was before they made all of the buffs raid-wide. You had to manually buff every single player, and Paladins had it the worst since their buffs only lasted for 5 minutes, so with 40 people, you were just constantly running around and buffing people for your 4-hour raid. It was made less awkward with add-ons, and later on they added 60-minute party-wide buffs at the cost of reagents, but in March of 2005, which was when this article was written, it was a cluster frick. Pardon my French. There weren't any AoE resurrects, so your healers would have to resurrect 39 people every wipe, and it goes on and on. 40 was a huge number, and it brought a lot of cumbersome aspects that you wouldn't think about. They foresee these encounters as mostly guild-related affairs, since guilds will initially have the easiest modes of organization within the guild interface or via their own websites. However, long-term, once they get some extra resources, they'd like to do some of the web-based group coordination stuff. So this looks like the birth of the idea of Dungeon Finder and ultimately LFR. I mean, it took them like 4 years for the Dungeon Finder, and like 7 years for Raid Finder, but they got there. Funny to think that had they had the resources in vanilla World of Warcraft, they may have had something like a Raid Finder. I wonder how that would have affected the game. What would the queue times be for Naxxramas, where one of the fights required 8 tanks? Interesting to think about. Here they talk about their lockout system, which was also revolutionary at the time. When triggered, you have up to 7 days to finish it. This way, if all of your healers and tanks are at a wedding or bar mitzvah, you can just hold off for a day or 2. Again, another thing that definitely wasn't standard at the time. The article itself mentions the Dark Age of Camelot and their marathon dungeon runs. You had to do it all in one run, which was unthinkable for guilds just starting out back then. I'll take his word for the Dark Age of Camelot. My personal experience, as you know, is the Star Wars Galaxies, and in that, like I mentioned in part 1, most of the dungeons weren't instanced. So there were still marathons with enemies constantly respawning, and you had to go through it all in one go, and the bosses had really long respawn timers, which was a marathon itself, just waiting for them to spawn sometimes. So, lockout timers, being able to return to the same run later on. Just like a passcode for an old NES game. Another huge thing that we surely took for granted at the time. Now, here's something really hardcore. Some of the raid instances are actually behind dungeon instances. The Molten Core raid is actually within the instance of the Blackrock Depths, so when you die, you actually respawn outside the instance of BRD, which will have most likely regenerated many ugly things. At this point, hopefully you have a surviving warlock within the raid that can summon you back beyond the green door. That's right, at first, the only entrance to the Molten Core was inside of the Blackrock Depths, and you had to go through the entire dungeon every single time. It was only later that we got that handy NPC that teleported us back in. The Blackrock Spire portal that they're referring to was actually the Blackwing Lair raid. By the time that came out though, they realized it was a bit hardcore to clear through an entire dungeon every time you wanted to raid, so they just had that shortcut with the orb right from the get-go. The portal still physically exists within the Blackrock Spire. It's right behind Nefarian in the arena portion of the raid, but you can only get there with some clipping shenanigans. And they took this idea even further with the Naxxramas raid in patch 1.11. The original planned entrance was inside the Strathholm dungeon to the left entering Rivender's courtyard. There was this green portal with an impassable portcullis blocking your path. Again though, clipping through, you'd find a small structure directly under the raid which you'd use to gain entry, but in similar fashion to the Blackwing Lair, they just moved Naxxramas outside to the Eastern Plaguelands with a teleporter located underneath it. Here we have some nifty screenshots. The ghost of a highborn. The elves who once ruled the Dire Maul when it was a great elf city called Elder Thalas. The highborn spirits guard the magic treasures hidden within. The Tower of Karazhan in the Deadwind Pass is the former home of the great wizard Medivh. And Jaina Proudmoore takes one for the Gipper. And here they give some previews of some upcoming dungeons and raids, such as Dire Maul, the Altric Valley, Ankiraj, the Blackwing Lair, Zul'Gurub, and Karazhan? Karazhan is an instance dungeon found in the Deadwind Pass. Only players of the highest level will be able to overcome the challenges held within. Unique in its design, it'll offer multiple sections, each of which play as a dungeon in and of itself, with at least 3 separate instance entrances. Okay, now this is pretty interesting. Karazhan in vanilla World of Warcraft. They say that it was planned to be a dungeon, but I can't help but think that this is a semantic issue. Do they mean dungeon in the literal sense as a place of exploration, or by World of Warcraft's definition of a 5-man versus a raid, which is of course 40-man at this point? Well, regardless, it's pretty interesting to see that it was supposed to come out during vanilla. Imagine running it with 40 people at level 60. Actually, now that I think about it, it's not that hard. I always thought that it could pass as a vanilla raid. It had all of the conventions, a giant labyrinth with a crazy amount of bosses and trash, and it was the only BC raid not located in a BC zone. It was here since the start, but it was just locked up. The most people saw of it were the old Karazhan crypts, which may have been an entire wing that they ended up scrapping once they decided to save it for BC. I guess they either ran out of time, or after the game exploded in popularity, sort of realized that they had the potential for expansions, and just decided to stick it in the Burning Crusade instead. It's interesting to think about though, because if it were in vanilla, that means Malchezaar wouldn't have been the final boss since he's of course a Draenei, and they weren't a thing until BC. That leaves the question, who would the final boss be? Since they name dropped him, I can't help but guess that Medivh would have been the finale had it panned out. Of course some Echo or Shade version though, since he's long dead by now. But how different things could have been. Speaking of which, in the description for Zul'Gurub, as you can see, it was originally intended to be for a group of 5. Of course, it later ended up being a 20-man raid. Pretty cool. Anyways, enough of PvE. Next up, we have some info on these crazy new instances called Battlegrounds. Battlegrounds are also instances where players can compete against the opposing faction in a more organized way than in other areas of the world, and you can anticipate many different types of goals. Again, at this point, there really wasn't any point in PvP other than for the sake of it. No points, no ranks, no gear, so these brand new instances with actual objectives and rewards were highly anticipated, and a first look article such as this was quite valuable at the time, I'm sure. In our first battleground, the goal is to defeat the enemy commander, of course talking about the Altric Valley here. You can try to accomplish this by charging the enemy base, but that'll be extremely hard, if not impossible, unless you have an overwhelming advantage in numbers. A true statement back then, as there were far more NPCs and they were more deadly in general. It was impossible to just push on through, and the battles took forever. You'd be in one for like 8 hours and then go to bed, wake up and queue again, and it's the exact same battle, and you may be pushed up a graveyard. So, over the years, as everything got nerfed, people adapted and started with the Zerg mode. Kind of funny that this is the actual strategy of the battleground today after all of the nerfs. There's a silent agreement. Everyone just runs past each other and rushes towards the enemy commander to either win or lose as fast as possible. It's a PvP battleground without the PvP. It used to almost be like a theme park, if you will. For example, if you were the Alliance, you'd tame rams in friendly territory in the north, and then collect pelts from the Hordes area in the south, and if you did that enough, you could summon a contingent of ram riders to charge all the way from your base to the enemy's, oftentimes enough to turn the tides of battle. And, to an even bigger degree, giant elemental lords that you can summon by turning in items looted from enemy players. They'd lay waste to everything around them, and if both factions summoned them at once, it was something out of a Godzilla movie. They say it right here actually. Quests will play a major part in PvP battlegrounds. While some players will be actively engaged in fighting enemy players, others will contribute by fulfilling quests that directly help their side's war effort. One of the earliest quests that you can complete to help your cause is finding mounts to create NPC cavalry units. Alliance get rams, and the Horde get frost wolves. And here we have some cool screenshots of some classic footage back then of players pushing through the front lines and fighting some NPCs. This took me like 2 hours, but I actually managed to retrace the steps to all 4 of these screenshots. It's kind of tough because this was pre-release obviously, and they actually changed a lot of the terrain, so I was wandering around chasing ghosts longer than I'd like to admit. For example, right here at the Iceblood graveyard, it looks like initially you could just climb right up to the resurrection point, but since that was pretty imbalanced, they cut it off by creating some hills here as a barrier. The other ones were pretty straightforward though. Just some differently placed trees and such, it looks like. Honor points are the reward for doing well at PvP. You can think of them as PvP experience points. Prior to their existence, there was no rhyme nor reason to PvP activity, and griefing was rampant. Oh yeah, that'll totally disappear now that players are rewarded for PvP. While that'll probably continue, the honor point system will at least give some players the incentive to play nice when they're massacring one another. Oh, I'm sure they will. It's quite fleshed out as they go on to describe the dreaded rank 14 system. These ranks are what confer you different benefits such as vendor discounts or special gear and new computer chairs, since yours probably looked like this if you're crazy enough to grind all the way to the top. That's something I'm very curious about for Official Classic. How are they going to handle the old rank 14 PvP system? They said that they were going for an authentic recreation, so that means it'll probably be in there, but I wonder how they're going to handle stuff such as account sharing, which was rampant during the time. For those who don't know, the rank 14 grind was insane. To rank up, you had to get more honor points than your fellow faction members, and only a certain amount could rank up each week. So naturally, the grind was all relative, and the time investment was as big as how much everyone else was playing, in essence 24/7. The points were tallied each week, and the people who played the most advanced, and the people who wanted to sleep instead regressed and they lost rank. Account sharing, sabotage, social engineering, win trading. It was a sight to behold, and from the looks of it, something we'll see again. And lastly, they go over the new world event system, which was also quite revolutionary at the time. As they say, there's not really an MMO that's doing anything similar to what we're trying to do with our world events. It really gives a dynamic feeling to the world, and really keeps on using this content over time approach. We want to make the world feel that much more living and breathing. If they're thinking about regular annual events, they must be pretty confident that World of Warcraft will see an awful lot of seasons come and go. If they can produce a continuing flow of new and quality content akin to what they started off with though, they can pretty much bank on that. And that's it. Battlegrounds, new instances, the honor system, world events, all of this stuff would slowly roll out as promised. Remember, this was March 2005. The honor system was released in patch 1.4, which arrived just 1 month later in April, and following that, the Altreich Valley came out along with Warsong Gulch in patch 1.5, which was 2 months later in June. And the next raid, the Blackwing Lair, was released 1 month after that in July. As for the comment of if they can produce a continuing flow of new and quality content akin to what they started with, it seems like they did a pretty good job, don't you think? That's about all I got for you though. Again, if you want to read all of this for yourself, I'll have a link in the description, so check that out. If you'd like to suggest articles, go ahead and I'll see what I can do. I hope you enjoyed this trip through time, like the video if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.